Thanks. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Happy to have you join us. For those of us who just joined us, feel free to keep getting your food and have a seat. So for those of you I don't know, my name is Dr. Ange-Marie Hancock. I'm the Executive Director of the Kerwin Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity here at OSU. Excited to have you join us today, and excited to those of you who are online joining us as well. I'm thrilled to be able to share this introduction of Tending to the Dead and Dying, Blackness, Memory, and the Radical Praxis, of Witness, in African American Cemetery Perspectives. So this is a classic academic title if we have ever seen one, but it is going to be a very interesting presentation. Before I do introduce our speakers for today, I do want to acknowledge the Global Arts and Humanities Discovery Theme, which funded this research here at The Ohio State University. So we're grateful to that selection committee and the folks who work on that discovery theme here on campus. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers. The first person you see at the top there, Dr. Jordan Linton Cox. She is the Associate Director of Research for Kerwin here at OSU. Before joining Kerwin, she built a robust research portfolio, unpacking the enduring legacies of colonialism and racial capitalism in the Caribbean and in the U.S. South. She's a trained anthropologist, I'm throwing that in. Her primary research examines modern Sino-Caribbean relations, specifically the development of Chinese identity in Jamaica and the impact of the People's Republic of China's expansion in the Caribbean. She is also a member of our leadership team here, and she just last month celebrated her one-year anniversary with Kerwin. So we are quite grateful for her work and her service here. In addition to Dr. Linton Cox, she will be joined by Rob Berry Jr. over here to my direct right. Rob is an educator, cultural critic, and theorist from the west side of Chicago, Illinois. As a PhD candidate and graduate teaching associate in the Department of Comparative Studies here at OSU in our College of Arts and Sciences, Rob's research employs Black critical theory, Black feminisms, Black masculinities, and Black visual culture and media to examine historical processes of Black ungendering in the afterlife of slavery. Specifically, Rob's research is concerned with the ways in which embodiments and performances of Black genders function as affective remnants of chattel slavery, animating and haunting those traditionally and non-traditionally rendered masculine across diasporic spaces atemporally. Rob earned a BA in Black Studies and Educational Studies from Denison and an MA in Critical Ethnic Studies from DePaul before joining us here at Ohio State, where he currently serves right here with us at Kerwin as one of our graduate research associates. So without further ado, take it away, Jordan and Rob. Thank you.
All right, so we want to thank you guys for joining us today. And we're going to be talking about a project that Rob and I have been working on together since the summer. And you see that the title has changed a little bit. This is like a working title for a paper that we're working on. So hence the academic-ese title. But it's called Tending to the Dead and Dying, Blackness, Memory, and the Radical Praxis of Witness in African American Cemetery Preservation. So we would be remiss without starting without a reminder that the land that we stand on and the land that we do this work on was land that was ceded in the 1975 Treaty of Boonville and the forced removal of tribes through the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and that it is the ancestral home of several Native American communities. We encourage you to engage with this information. There are several resources that we're happy to share with you that can help you to understand where the land that we do this work on comes from. And we continue to recognize that we are visitors on this land and hope to become guests that honor Indigenous past, present, and future.
In keeping the theme of academics, we love to give you a nice agenda to let you know where we're going. to ensure that we aren't lost on our journey together. So to get us started, we're going to do a couple introductions, thinking about when and where we enter. We think that's important to understand who's in front of you, but also who are we bringing with us as we have this conversation. And then we're going to think about the ways in which how we initially started this project. And so thinking about the framework and method of Sankofa, and then transferring over to the ways in which we had to reimagine our project and thinking about how we did that through the frame of the Black study, and then thinking about where are we going in the future with this project that we are going to present with y'all today.
Okay, so if you went to the Kerwin website right now, you would see pictures very similar to this of myself and Rob, with some like really fancy information about the things that we do and the places that we've been and where we got our degrees, and really big words that you may or may not know what exactly they mean, right? And all those are important to kind of framing who we are and who we come to the table as. But we wanted to do a little bit of a reframing of how, where, and when we enter this space. So this idea comes from Anna Julia Cooper's A Woman from the South, Voice from the South by a Black Woman from the South. And Anna Julia Cooper was introduced to me by a friend while I was working on my dissertation. And she was a woman that was born enslaved, ended up getting her master's in mathematics, and then became the fourth Black woman to get her PhD. And in this kind of memoir where she talks about herself, she writes, "Only the Black woman can say when and where I enter, in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, then and there the whole Negro race enters with me." And this quote of when and where I enter has been kind of championed by ethnic studies scholars, including folks like Gary Hiro, who's an Asian American scholar, to think about the fact that how we enter a place, the kind of our trajectory, our positionality, the people that we entered in the space with, all that matters, all that impacts how we do our work. And so we wanted to reintroduce how we, Rob and I, are entering this work today. So I enter as, a lot of the students here call me Dr. J. I enter as a storyteller, a traveler, a foodie. I describe my community engagement as being a sister, cousin, niece, and friend to those that I work with, and a former professor. I enter as a child of Caribbean immigrants, my mother from the country of Guyana, which is the only English-speaking country in South America, and my father, a person of the Jamaican diaspora. He was born in England because of Windrush, which was the process of Jamaican migrants being kind of incentivized to go to England during and after World War II to kind of rebuild the country. And so my grandparents were some of those folks that traveled to England, ended up having a family there, ended up shipping their kids all the way around. So my dad ended up doing a lot of the secondary education in Jamaica and then coming to the United States at 18. I come as a child that was shaped by movement and migration. So first of all, my parents came to this space through migration, but they moved me too. So I got my first passport by the age of 1. I was traveling independently, internationally by the age of 9. I visited 6 continents and lived in 5 states and 2 countries. And so this process of movement has kind of really grounded how I see myself in the world. And one of the critical things that has come from this is the importance of community. So I call myself a researcher both of and in community, because my parents really grounded for me that community is the way that we move forward. My work started with Chinese Jamaican community organizations, thinking about their identity and how they were navigating China's increasing presence in Jamaica. It includes a project we'll talk about a little later, the Brush Arbor Starkville Colored Community Engaged Field Program, and it has brought me here to Kerwin. On the screen, you'll see some pictures that kind of evoke this journey. Wait, before you do that. So there's the picture of Empire Windrush, one of the ships that brought Jamaicans to England. There's a picture of a statue that's in Emancipation Park in Kingston, Jamaica, which is where I did my research. And then there's some pictures of the place that grounds me, which is Brooklyn, New York. If you're familiar with New York, you'll notice the Labor Day Parade, which is kind of like a carnival celebration in New York. And then you can press enter now. Here are some folks that have kind of helped me to understand how my journey could be legible in an academic space. starting with Dr. Kristen Congdon, who first introduced me to research, Dr. Tiffany Willoughby-Farrar, Dr. Ellen Wu, and Dr. Daniel Martinez-Hosing. All of these folks helped me to see how me, a second-gen Black girl from Brooklyn, could navigate an academic space.
And I have to follow that up. No. So from where and when I enter, instead of Rob Berry Jr., I put the soon to be Dr. B because that's come sooner than later. I am, as Dr. Hancock already mentioned, an educator, critical theorist. I'm also a visionary, and I'm also an R&B enthusiast. Hit me up if you need a playlist. I am a grandchild of the Great Migration. So thinking about the ways in which my grandparents maneuvered from Oxford, Mississippi, and also from Louisiana to get to Chicago, Illinois. I'm also shaped by Blackened geographies, and we're going to talk about what does it mean to be Blackened further on in the presentation. And some of those geographies are the west side of Chicago, to not be confused with the south side of Chicago. And enduringly, that's the west side, that's K-Town, that's 290 for the newer folks who like to call it that. Also, Heritage of Christ Missionary Baptist Church is where I learned a lot about memory. I learned a lot about Blackness. I learned a lot about preservation. I learned a lot about death at that church. Also, the places that schooled me, I don't want to say educated me, but the places that schooled me, King Elementary, Go Black Elementary, and Prosser Career Academy, and also my undergrad institution, Denison University. I'm also cared for by a long line of hands carrying the same name as me, and so my name is an indictment to the individuals that came before me. So my first name is Robert. That is my great grandfather's name, which is also my grandfather's name, which is also my father's name, right? My middle name, Allen, which is a tribute to my grandmother, Eileen, who is on the screen, and then Barry, which is my paternal grandfather's last name. And also being careful about those who do not hold the last name as me, right? I'm an individual, in the words of Beyonce, I'm not in a gang, but I have a lot of people that walk with me. I'm not going to say exactly what she said, but I'm not in a gang, but I have a lot of people that walk with me. And you see all the people that walk with me everywhere I enter, whether you see them or you don't see them, right? So if you see at the top my OSU fam through the Black Caucus and Professional Student Organization, my other Columbus family, and we all in green. I just celebrated a birthday not too long ago. We all wore green to celebrate abundance and growth. My grandmother, Eileen Berry, my two chosen sisters in the middle, Jaquay and Precious. My big sister, she don't like me calling her big, but my big sister, Simone, who is holding me, physically holding me. And then at the bottom, my mother, my sister, and my nephew, my father, and then at the bottom, my mother when she was younger, and our grandmother, and also my aunt, who are all ancestors. I'm also a certified Beehive member, platinum status. This summer platinum. This summer will mark my eighth time seeing her in concert. And then through that, I've transformed my love of music, film, television into teaching, cultural criticism, and also theory.
I think he topped. He topped me. But so we want to kind of frame this conversation. So we've introduced ourselves, right? And now we want to frame where we're going. And so there's two kind of thoughts or two kind of questions that really frame how we have thought about this project. And I think some of these might resonate with you guys in this current period. The first question is, what does it mean to reconstruct, reroute, or reimagine after loss? Right? And so that loss can be loss of a space, a life, a project, or a future. And what happens when reimagining demands both mourning and movement at the same time? Right? The second question is, how do we engage in the labor of rebuilding when the very conditions that necessitate reconstruction are shaped by structures of dispossession, violence, and rupture? So how do we move in a space of those are some questions that we carried alongside with this.
So thinking about what did we imagine when we first united last summer, we're going to think about this through the framework of the method of Sankofa. Before I get started, who has heard of this name before? Okay, we see some hands in here, okay? And so to think about the word Sankofa, Sankofa comes from the Akan tribe of Ghana. And that loosely translates to go back and get it. Okay? So we think about go back and get it. We think about the ways in which to think about how does history informs how we move forward, right? And so we think about the illustration of the Sankofa bird. It nourishes itself by feeding backwards, right? And so in order for us to move forward, in order for us to think about how do we maneuver through this world that's always shifting, we have to nourish ourselves by looking at the pathways in which that folks have set for us to move forward. Okay, and so for us, Sankofa is a method/framework that encourages learning from the past to inform the future, reaching back to move forward, and lifting as we transgress. Okay, and so with us, we think about how we formed this dynamic duo last summer. The project and funding came through, again, the Global Arts and Humanities Discovery theme, and we wanted to think about how to support the community engaged field program. And so some of the key goals and collaborative efforts that we had when we first started was building local, national, and transnational partnerships, engaging scholars, activists, and cultural heritage organizations and community members in thinking about how does one think about the work of memory, but how do we do it with community, right? Because this work does not exist without the folks in which that exist within these spaces that we speak of. Also, strengthening praxis and conducting critical research, as we will talk about later, addressing the erasure, neglect, and displacement of these burial grounds belonging to marginalized peoples, and also supporting initiatives for recognition, preservation, and ideas to memorialize sacred sites.
Okay, so we're going to start with where this project was supposed to go. So I want to give props to Dr. Hancock, who I think a month after me starting here at Kerwin, one of the things that was really near and dear to my heart was this project called the Community Engaged Build Program. And I made it very clear that, like, if I was coming here, this was coming with me. And so one of the things that Dr. Hancock recommended was that I apply for the guided funds to get some support here to do this work. And that's how Rob and I started working together. So this project was a community engaged field school centered around the Brush Arbor, which is a name that was given to the site, formerly known as the Starkville Colored Cemetery in Starkville, Mississippi, where I was formerly an assistant professor of anthropology at Mississippi State University. And so this was a 3-year NEH-funded project that I acquired in my first year I was working with, I was not even on the committee, I was working alongside a grad student who needed some support, and she was telling me about this cemetery in the town that I had just moved to. And when I went to the physical side of the cemetery, I was shocked, right? It was the main street, one of the main streets in Starkville, University Drive, cuts through, there are 2 cemeteries, one on the left, one on the right. And the one on the right is beautiful, pristine gravestones going all the way back to the 1800s, which are still legible and together in formal lines. Had some, not formal gating, but had some kind of gating around it, had signs, had a cemetery preservation committee, all the things. On your left-hand side was this space, a historically black cemetery that was on sloped land, experienced a lot of erosion due to rain. The headstones were broken, sometimes by people, sometimes by nature, sometimes by mowers. It was covered in beer bottles and beer cans, as this site is in downtown Starkville, near to where the students drink after games. And so it was a site that had all this kind of debris across it. People frequently walked their dogs. There was nothing kind of identifying the site from other sites around it. And the only difference between those 2 sites is one was predominantly white, the pristine site, and the other one was on the National Register of Historic Places. So this cemetery that was experiencing all this degradation was actually a historic site. And not only that, but both actually were owned by the city. And so you can see the structural, the kind of structural oppression that's clearly wrought across these sites that are literally across the street from each other, right? And so one of the things that I wanted to do, I'd seen a lot of small efforts to kind of preserve the sites, which are all important. And I wanted to kind of think about how do we get the community involved and how do we have one movement to preserve this site. And this is where the field school came in. So we brought 10 students in a year from all over the country whose their passion was to preserve this site and to work with community members across 13 community partners to preserve the site. And so I was the founding director and kind of organizer of this project. We worked with HBCUs in the state, school teachers, like all these folks to really create this decolonial field school that would train students in how to honor this space and honor spaces that they fought for in the future. Now, a year and a half into my tenure as the director of this site and associate director, I decided to come to Kerwin. And it was decided by the university that the project would not come with me. And so that was a really hard moment, right? So we had done all this work to kind of seed the ground for Kerwin and Ohio State to kind of serve in the role of continuing this movement and continuing this plight. But it was decided that the goal would be for the project to remain at Mississippi State. So the question is, how do you pivot from there, right? What do you do? That question that we started with. How do you pivot amongst loss? How do you mourn and at the same time? How do you think about what is needed to move forward? And that was the process that Rob came into and that we began to navigate together.
And so situating ourselves with that question, like how do we mourn, but how do we also move? It's thinking with a method of Black study, right? So we all may be aware of the discipline that is Black studies, right? The study of so on and so forth, right? But the method in which it means to like Black study is how we begin to reimagine how do we shift through this time in which all of the hard work that Dr. J had done needed to look different for us. And so thinking about Black study is to invite Dr. Fred Moden into the space, okay? And Dr. Fred Moden gives us this quote, and it says, "What is Black study but an alternative form of aspiration? An attempt to keep breath in the Black body and through anti-Blackness as the total climate. An attempt to administer care with and in technologies of capture. What is there to do but weather the storm?" Okay? And so Fred Moden and other Black critical scholars give us many different roadmaps of what it means to tend to Black study. And these are just some of them. These are not all of them. So don't take us as this is Black study. And so embodied practice shows up as Black study. So thinking about the ways in which folks find ways to survive in cases in which folks aren't meant to survive. Thinking about the impossibilities of Black life, but also thinking about the possibilities. Thinking about breath. And Fred Moden mentions breath. Christina Sharp mentions breath. Like, what does it mean to pour breath back into the bodies in which breath is always taken away from? And also an embodied practice of refusal. We hear a lot about resistance, right? Push back against the system, push back against the system. But what it means to turn your back to the system. What it means to refuse what has been refused to you. Okay? Black study is labor. Black study is work. It is hard work. Okay? And it's a work towards liberation. And so that is unlearning a world in which that we've been taught certain different things. All right. And we can all situate ourselves in the current climate of what we've been learning, right? But what does it mean to sit there and unlearn, right? But also to remake, to strategize. Okay. Also reckoning with the climate. And we keep coming back to this idea of climate, right? We all exist. Well, in this space, we all exist in the Midwest. We don't know where everyone is online, but in this space, we all exist in the Midwest. And the climate in Ohio is always shifty, right? Yesterday was 62 degrees. Today, we all shivering for our lives. But that is the uncertainty of the climate in which that impacts the lives of Black people. The uncertainty. We don't always have an answer for the ways in which life is impacting folks. But we do know where we can find that root. But that's reckoning with the climate. And also being still, sitting with yourself, but also sitting with folks, right? To sit with the dead and also dying while also stilling back life. And so the idea, what does it mean to take back the lives about take back the lives for the individuals who were never meant to live. Okay, and that goes back into togetherness, and also goes back to the idea of slowing down. Like sometimes we be like, we got to protest, we got to do this, we got to do this, get this. Like what it means to slow down and truly strategize. And also, in some cases, we strategize enough, so now it's time to speed this up. Okay. So again, this isn't the totality of Black study, but these are different ways Black critical scholars are thinking about Black study.
And so another person that we brought into the space when we're thinking about this is the work of like Paulo Freire. So thinking about popular education movements, thinking about the idea that the knowledge is within the community, right? The knowledge is already here. So we are just tapping into the knowledge that already exists. One quote from Paulo Freire in The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which many have read, is liberation is a praxis. The action and reflection of men and women upon their world in order to transform it. Those truly committed to the work or to the cause of liberation can accept it, neither the mechanistic concept of consciousness as an empty vessel to be filled, nor my thing is really small, nor use the banking methods of domination, propaganda, slogans, deposits in the name of liberation. And so what we get from Paulo Freire and Pedagogy of the Oppressed is that praxis requires action, right? But it also requires theory, right? And it requires advocacy. It requires all these things together. It's not just to do the work in the ivory tower of thought, but it is to take that thought and to kind of push it into action. And so what we were hoping that my collaboration with Rob would be, and you can go to the next slide, is how do we pair, so in one of the things that when we were thinking about what had I learned from my process as directing a field school about preservation of a Black space, what was missing, right? What was missing that was allowing people to do this work? And one of the things that we realized was missing was that for a lot of people in preservation work, they weren't as familiar with Black critical thought. And so a lot of times they were advocating for Black spaces without understanding of like how Black people think about mourning, how African Americans think about death, how we think about those sites, the afterlives of slavery, right? There was a decontextualization of the work. But then sometimes in Black studies, there wasn't always the action, right? There were some folks who were only theorizing and not, in the cemetery with the bodies, right? And so how did we bring those two things together? Rob's experience with Black studies and thinking about death through the lens of what Black studies scholars have provided, and then my experience having been on the ground in these spaces doing this communal work. So we came up with what we call our Black study praxis. And there were three kind of areas that we put our effort into. One was the formation of the Black Cemetery Scholars Collective. Two was the creation of some writing groups and resources. And three was scholarship. We're going to go through the kind of three outcomes that we are working on and have created thus far. So the first thing that we talked about was that in the preservation space, something that was missing was a network that could bind those folks who were doing the theoretical and the practical work of preservation together. So they could think through some of the challenges that they were struggling with, and also think through strategies of funding. Think through, okay, you have this Black cemetery, this historically African-American cemetery. You need to do GPR, ground penetrating radar, in order to understand where people are buried because there aren't headstones for every space. Who is going to do the GPR? What agencies can you depend on to do the work? Who do you ask to do LIDAR, which is another type of geographic kind of examination of the ground, right? How do you pair with other people? What funding sources are good for this work, right? So really creating a network of information sharing. So already in the space existed the Black Cemetery Network, which was created by Dr. Antoinette Jackson out of University of South Florida. And she has this amazing repository of all the sites, of many sites across the United States that are undergoing preservation efforts through community members, through scholars, etc. But the actual kind of mobilization of those people together to kind of create together was something that still needed to be done. And so we created this network to kind of think about how do we do this work together. And the first call-out meeting that we had was myself, Dr. Jackson, Dr. Elvin Klug, who looks at works for the preservation of the Laurel Cemetery Memorial Project outside in Baltimore, and Rob. And so we met together with several other scholars, practitioners, etc., to talk about the question of collective action after the African American Burial Ground Preservation Act. With the African American Burial Ground Preservation Act is actually very interesting and actually connects us here. So the African American Burial Grounds Preservation Act was an act that was intended to fund the work of preservation. So it was, the act was passed, however, it had not yet been funded. And it was passed through the efforts of former Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio. And so there was actually an explicit link back here to this space. And so we were thinking about how do we advocate for the allocations of funds to this act? And then how do people actually apply for it? It was supposed to be through the National Park Service, right? And so now you can kind of see how these things connect even to this moment right now, right? We're thinking about federal funding. And so that was the first thing that we wanted to talk about is like, how do we form collective action in order to kind of figure out how folks can get access to this funding to do this work?
And so I won't stand with you all with these guiding questions, but these were our 4 guiding questions that led us to the Black Cemetery Scholars Collective. And so thinking about the ways in which preservation is documented and also theorized, we wanted to complicate that, right? So when we think about preservation, we think about how do we keep things the same, and so how we keep things the same, we have to be mindful of things are supposed to change. Right. And so if things are supposed to change, how do we complicate the preservation of spaces that are supposed to be the final resting place of people? Right. And so also thinking about who benefits from this idea of preservation, repair, and also how can we extend our work beyond academic circles, as Dr. J already said, and also think about what are the best practices for engaging local communities and preserving and advocating for Black cemeteries.
So we started with the Black Cemetery Scholars Network, which had its second meeting last week. A scholar from Jackson State. Jackson State is a really interesting case study. They have their own cemetery that they are working to preserve. And they talked about their preservation methods and what they're doing and how they're navigating this moment. So we are continuing to meet together to strategize, to commune. But from that also came a bi-weekly virtual writing group where we spend time together writing about this work. Rob and I developed a Black memory and death reading list. So we wanted to create a reading list around 2 kind of hinging questions. One was, what is the kind of global ethnic studies literature around death and dying? And 2, what was the community engaged research around preservation? And what were the areas in which we could connect these 2 forms of literature together? Which connects kind of to the paper that we're going to talk about next, which came out of that work. And then we also, if you can go back, Rob, we are very lucky that OSU librarian Nita Hendricks created the Black Cemetery Scholars Library Guide, which she has curated and developed this library guide for folks who are interested in the work of preservation. And she has attended, I think, all of our meetings, as well as kind of strategized alongside us. And so we are very grateful for our library system being so committed to this work. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the scholarship. So one of the things that we wanted to do was to write a paper and to think about the kind of grapple with the topics that Rob and I've been talking about through the lens of academic literature, while we're also doing this practical work as well. And so there are kind of 4 moments or quotes that guided us through the creation of this paper, which has the long name of Tending to the Dead and Dying, Black Memory, and the Radical Praxis of Witness in African American Cemetery Preservation. So I'll share 2 and Rob will share 2. So one came from Dr. Antoinette Jackson, hosted a kind of, at the last AAA, so American Anthropological Association was in Tampa this year, and she hosted this offsite event, kind of thinking through Black cemetery preservation in Florida and the resources that were available and the people that were doing this work. And as a part of this, which is really evocative of the praxis that we're talking about, she had a poet read this poem that it's called Pauper Cemetery Poppy Field. and it really kind of stuck with me. And it's an excerpt of this poet, Jamie Dawson, the poet herself, says, "Pauper cemetery, pauper field, poor Black bones painted over by concrete. This isn't the first time Black bodies have disappeared, poor Black and sold to an unmarked grave." And she's thinking about the ways in which often African American cemeteries become found when folks are trying to build over that land and use it for something else. Like we think about the African American burial site in New York was found when they were trying to build over that land. And so we think about that. And then Terrell McCann, a student here at OSU who is also an embalmer at a Black family-owned funeral home in Cleveland.
Yes.
He spoke with us about his work, and he said Black care work is both science and art. So the actual process of caring for the dead is not just science. There is also an art to this. And so to think about that dichotomy, right, when you're doing this work, that it is not just the practical, but it is also the emotional, it is also the memory, it is also the connection to the past.
So keeping that idea alive, the next quote comes from Dr. Tier, and it might sound familiar to you if you listen to music, but she said, and during one talk, it said, "We dress a certain way, we walk a certain way, we talk a certain way, we paint a certain way, we make love a certain way. All these things we do in a different, unique, specific way that is personally ours." And that is cited in Beyonce's 7th studio album, Renaissance.
Again, platinum status.
Thank you. But this quote led us to this work, because if we do all these different things differently, right? Imagine how we do death differently. How do we celebrate the lives who have been transitioned differently than what the ways in which it's been painted, right? And then lastly, from the 2019 film Queen and Slim, when Queen is met with her demise, her last words are, "Can I be your legacy?" So thinking about the ways in which how we celebrate and how do we mourn is thinking about how do we substantiate the lives of the individuals who no longer exist with us.
And I'm going to go through this slide fairly quickly because I want to make sure that we have time to talk and to discuss and to commune together. But we kind of have like a couple of bodies of literature that we relied on to kind of think through the central question of connecting Black studies work to the practice of cemetery preservation. So first, the work of preservation itself. Secondly, the literature on death and dying. So thinking about death not only as a moment, but as one moment, but as a continuum of moments. And thinking about it also in the terms of memory and history. And then finally, literature around the afterlife of slavery and Black death. And so thinking about how scholars in the past talked about death and slavery and the effects of slavery, both structurally, physically, legally, et cetera, et cetera. And so we'll go to the next slide.
Right. And so also what's really important to our work is thinking about the terminology of the Black end, right? And so when we hear the term Black, we understand that that is categorized as a racial identity, a categorization, so on and so forth, right? That tends to the visuality of what it means to be a racialized object or subject within the afterlife of slavery. When we think about the term Black and we think about Fanon, we're thinking about Christina Sharp, this idea of a process, right? And so to be Black is a process, it's also a project. When we say a project, it's something that's ongoing, something that's always worked on, right? Once you think you got the code to the project, you got to, it sometimes needs to be reprogrammed, okay? And so that structures the movements of bodies, attaching and shifting meaning to those who are stolen Africans, and marks one within and outside the visual, social, and political logics of Blackness. And essentially, it means to be marked as Black. And what does it mean to be marked as Black within these theories? It means to be marked for death. Okay.
So two central themes have come through in our writing so far. The first theme that we want to talk about is the sites themselves. So sites as spaces of violence and erasure. So here we think about cemeteries and resting sites. So we think about often when we come across Black cemetery sites, there is often desecration of those sites, there's neglect, there's a lack of ownership often, there's issues with like who actually owns the land. Sometimes one issue that like a lot of people in the collective have come across is what happens when there are private owners or commercial owners of Black cemetery sites. Now, a lot of states have laws where archaeologists are supposed to check the land for burials before you're able to do any commercial projects. But sometimes when people just have the land, they can't do projects, but they might have some restrictions on what you can do to preserve that space. And so, how do we navigate ownership of a space that is sacred, right? The archive, so we think about violence and erasure, so folks like Michael Roth-Trio, Sadia Hartman have all talked about the fact that the archive itself is incomplete, right? The archive itself at times marks people as chattel. And how do you navigate and archive information about these sites when those sites are incomplete? So an example is in Mississippi, they did not start collecting birth or death certificates until I think it was like 1910, right? So then how do you actually look back and try to figure out who people were when you only have like 100 years of records, right? And some people existed between records. In Mississippi, you will also often find that courthouses or record houses were burned down, right? Had fires, just random fires, not even like, malicious, just as hot. So like, how do you then do the work of preservation, do the work of memory when the archives themselves are sometimes actively kind of pushing back against you, right? Or sometimes they're just incomplete. Urban displacement, so thinking about gentrification and redlining, which has both dispossessed Black communities, and there's a lot of literature on that, but also impacts the actual land on which these sites exist. So thinking about the fact that that one road in Mississippi used to be a dirt road, and that downtown used to be a plantation, right? And so one of the streets names around that area is Lambkin, because a lambkin was the person that owned that land. And so how do you navigate this space with all these like remnants of the history and also the ways in which the site has changed over time? And then finally, we think about the connections of death and violence to broader systems like the carceral system and socioeconomic violence.
And so our next critical thing is thinking about the idea to witness as praxis, right? And so we think about witness, thinking about witness as a theoretic, but also an active movement of Black study. And so witnessing is not passive observation, but a labor of Black being that refuses the enclosure of Black suffering with silence. It is an embodied refusal and insistence that Black death will not be absorbed into the brutal economies of the wake. Thinking about Christina Sharp here. Witnessing is about thinking about the ways in which we are rendered invisible, but we also are rendered hypervisible. So to always be seen and also unseen at the exact same time, right? And it's forcing the idea to tend to those, whether that may be putting somebody on a T-shirt, whether that might be pouring out for your lost one, if you know what I mean, right? So there's different ways in which to reckon with the idea that Blackened individuals are rendered invisible and also hypervisible. But this is not a survival as victory, but it is an endurance, right? So think about how do we continue to move forward through and when we face these different forms of gratuitous violence. Okay.
And before you go to the next slide, I just want to say when we're thinking about this in the course of this paper that we're writing, we're thinking about like what is the practical ways of preservation when witness looks so many different ways, right? So what happens with witness is a T-shirt, when it's a hashtag, when it's a website, when it's the belongings of your loved one that you keep behind, because we know that if the sites themselves, we cannot rely on them to be there forever, right? The sites themselves are being lost. And also people at different times did not have the money for a headstone, right? And that's why we often have to do GPR on these sites, because there are no headstones. Sometimes there's just metal rod, right? There's just some fragments left behind from some plates or some sometimes you'll find a non-native plant, and somebody planted that in memory of their loved one. So when we think about preservation in these Black spaces, we actually have to open up what witness looks like, right? Witness and compiling an archive of witness includes a lot of different actions of remembrance, not just, noting where a body was buried. And so those are some things that when we're thinking about the praxis of witness, we're thinking about this in theoretical ways, but we're also thinking about it in practical ways. And thinking about, there's this kind of ongoing tension in the preservation world about like, are you supposed to keep cemeteries prestige? Is that the goal, to make it a place to walk through? Or is the goal from some places to actually let them continue to decay, but to decay with reverence, not to decay like with people drinking and throwing beer bottles down, but how do we keep a place sacred, but also not necessarily reconstruct everything perfectly, right? Because decay is a part of life too. And so there's these kind of tensions within the work. And witness is kind of a way forward of creating a kind of more capacious scene to kind of think about multiple ways of remembrance that don't only include the binaries of everything has to be kept perfect and everything only has to be left to decay.
And so again, thinking about the practice of doing these things, we're going to watch two short clippings. One is a jazz funeral. Has anyone ever heard of jazz funerals before? We're going to watch a short clip of a documentary that give us an explanation of the jazz funeral. So thinking about the ways in which different geographies, right? So we're thinking about New Orleans and Louisiana and how they celebrate the passing of one. And then we're going to look at a clip. I'll give you more context to that clip after we watch the clip of the jazz funeral.
Yeah. And you go to pop. What we do there in the rest of the United States of America could be Boston.
We place a great importance on culture. And that's something that you see in how we celebrate life and how we even deal with death.
James Brown is a ceremony. We play soul, dirges. Dirges like, hear my God, the evening.
That's the mourning part. You give into your grief, you know that you won't see him again, but just what happened to know they were involved in life.
And then they say some deceased out the burial site. And then you start to play up tempo songs, you play a break from them.
That's the self-reward part. It's the whole get it again, get it again. Because, yeah, I say it all. I'm sure it was nice to know.
Second line is the following. The next thing that they do is called second line. The thing about second line is everybody is style. Some people just walk. Some people really get down. Some people get down. We can do what you want. It's perfect. Fresh. It's free. It's one of our own ceremonies and it has a lot of needs and they push the vision, how it ties in the vision is that the afterlife is rich and full. And the person is one of the so this person is dead, they go on to riches.
And so, if you're thinking about the ways in which jazz funerals are constructed, right? You hear them talk about the first half with the dirges you see the mourning. It's a slowness, right? Going back to the idea of Black study, and then once that aspect is finished, then you see the celebratory aspect, right? It's dancing on the coffin, lifting the coffin up, dancing in the street. Like there's a freeness around celebrating an individual who has passed within the jazz funeral. That's in New Orleans, right? But then in Chicago, we gonna unite and have a good old homegoing. All right. And so it was gonna keep going, right? But I don't know if you all saw the comments that were coming up. This was filmed via Facebook. All right. This was the
So this was a homegoing of Rob's own family at their not at their at their home church, but this was a grouping of his family members in a choir together, singing, and I think it was your aunt, of a family member that they had lost, right? And so even, just remembering that moment, but also the ability to share that moment in virtual spaces as a form of witness that is witnessing too.
oh, excuse me, to add more context, this was the funeral of my cousin, Tiffany Berry, who passed in 2017. And I think about in relation to witness, who the ways in which the world is set up, who is allowed to even bear witness, right? I think I get so emotional thinking about work kept me away from actually celebrating being there physically. And so for people who physically couldn't take off of work, people physically, if you don't go to work, you don't live, you don't nourish yourself. And so how do you make space for other folks to witness? And so being able to share her homegoing celebration virtually was something that I think my family did well because she was loved. She is loved by many. Oh. Okay. So as we get ready to close out our conversation, is thinking specifically about while we do all this work to preserve the memories of individuals, we have to be mindful of what does it mean to actually preserve the memory of people, right? And so we have two images of two young ladies that were taken from us too early in 2000. So Breonna Taylor, I'm pretty sure we are aware of her murder, and then Toyin Salua, I believe that's how you pronounce her last name, who was also murdered in 2020. And so this quote from this text, I think, is really important when we think about the complicated ways of preserving one's memory, right? So in death, Brianna and Toyin are queens, they are angels, they are saints, they are cover girls, they are muses, they are regal and chic and beautiful, they are merchandise, they are screensavers, they are profitable. Their stylized images afford them a bizarre social capital they were denied while they were alive. They are everything but done justice. And maybe some part of this process is an unspoken concession of this. Maybe we put crowns on their heads and surround them with symbols because it is much easier to make them queens and cover girls in the afterlife than to lay justice at their altar. Maybe we are thinking about their images as failures, excuse me. But in doing that in such a way, we also obscure the violent material realities that cause their murders to make their memory more palatable. And so this is one way we're complicating thinking about preservation in our own work, is while we would love to keep the memories alive of the ones that we've lost, we also got to think about the ways in which we have lost them. We don't want to divorce how we've lost our loved ones from the fact that the total climate, and thinking about the literature that we've presented to you, is related to anti-Blackness. Okay.
Okay, so what does this work look like in its next iteration, right? So we've talked about the paper that we're working on, and that is a continued work in progress. In the future, we want to continue to think about research and scholarship that continue to move this work forward in theoretical spaces. We want to think about complicating geographies. So think about death in an international context. In particular, I think about death in Jamaica, which has a different kind of ways in which people navigate death and socioeconomic status and life. If you ever look up Jamaican tombstones, they're actually very ornate and beautiful, but they're often like in the wilderness, in land that is not taken care of. And so you'll see these beautiful ornate tombstones that like kind of reflect people's lives and the lives that they lived. But over time, they often kind of get left to decay. Kind of thinking through that context, complicating witness. So thinking about gender, queer communities, thinking about space and place, and how those aspects also complicate the idea of witness and death. We also want to do the continued practical work of expanding the Black Cemetery Scholars Collective. Continuing the working group, continuing knowledge sharing. Some members are really interested in doing an edited volume, and that's something that some members are really trying to push forward. And then finally, collaboration. So we talked through with the African American and African Studies Community Extension Center about doing some work locally and thinking about cemetery sites here in Ohio, and also how the Great Migration impacted death and how people preserve sites and where people were buried. And then also future collaborations that we would like to do with the Ohio History Connection. So really grounding this work locally is something that we are working with different organizations to do. But the work of organizing is it takes time. And so this is something that we're moving forward and progressing with. So we want to kind of recognize the work of others who have helped to guide us on this journey. We also want to have some thanks for the folks who have worked alongside us. So people not on here is anybody who's ever talked with us about this topic. So shout out to you, Corinne. People who have listened to us ramble. Shout out to my partner who's potentially online. The Kerwin Institute for housing this project. Got it for funding it. The Black Cemetery Scholars Collective for showing up all the time. The African American and African Studies Community Extension Center, OSU Libraries, specifically Letta and Leticia. The Black Cemetery Network, that's Dr. Jackson, Laurel Cemetery Memorial Project, Dr. Flew. We'd like to thank Terrell for talking with us, Jamie for letting us use her work, and viewers like you.
Those of you who are newer to the space, or if you're newer online, the typical practice that we do is we alternate between questions that are in the room and questions that are online. Both Jordan and Rob will take their own questions, but just so you know, that's kind of how we do it to make sure that the folks online feel equally included. And folks online, please do use the Q&A box. You can kind of see it on your screen there to put any questions that you may have for the two speakers today. So thank you again.
Fair.
Really interesting presentation on a really interesting and important topic. While you were talking, I was thinking about this. Kind of reminds me a lot about the debates around Jewish remembrance in Europe for how they recognize and treat certain spaces that contain a lot of Jewish death. And my question for you is, whose role is it to preserve the memory of Black folks and others who are the stakeholders? Is this a role that the state should take on, that we should on private individuals, local communities, racial communities? We talk about the practicality of it. There's space to be allocated, tax dollars to be allocated, people to be hired to preserve some of these things. And I was curious how you see the role in this, both from a normative standpoint and then also from a practical standpoint.
Yeah, I'll maybe start, and then Rob, if you want to join in. So that's a really hard question. So who is responsible, right? That's a hard question. I'm not always quite sure. I think that depends on the site. I think it's more practical is who's taking responsibility, and who needs to be a part of that conversation. conversation. So descendants need to be a part of that conversation, but also community changes over time, right? So we think about the Great Migration, folks leaving the US South coming to the Midwest. That means that there's a lot of sites that are cemeteries where their ancestors are no longer there. So just with the Starkville Cemetery, Starkville Colored Cemetery, I met descendants that were all over the United States. I actually ended up speaking about legislature. I was in DC for a conference, and there was a descendant that worked in the Senate, and so she was like, "Can you come to like go through all the security and come see me, and we can talk through this." So like there are people are really spread out, right? And so we want to think about that. I think there's that aspect. I know a lot of people have been talking about the logistics of ethics with this. So currently we have the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA. There have been discussions about having a similar one for African American communities that can kind of provide funding, but also some structure, logistic and ethical for how this work is to be done. But a lot of this stuff is in progress. So I think right now, the practical kind of reality is that there are a mixture of folks who are taking on this work. There are people in academic spaces, there are people who are in libraries, there are people who are just, bought the land and then realized that this is happening and now they're doing the work, right? But I think the more important question for me is always who needs to be a part of the conversation for it to actually progress in a way that's productive. And for me, that includes descendants. It includes a capacious understanding of community, both those who live there now and those who have also moved away. It includes your state leaders, because they're going to have to be doing the work on the legislation side to kind of support these sites. It often includes your state archaeologist, who might be helping, because a lot of times states have their own kind of funding for this kind of stuff. So I think you have to think about coalition building more than who should be there, because I think, unfortunately, we're already in a state where we're coming to something that has been broken. So I think we think more about who should be in the process of care. So kind of the process that's in COPA that we looked at, like thinking back to look forward, who has not been a part of this process, and to think about who should be a part of the next step. Rob, did you have anything to add?
I think you covered that question pretty well.
Thank you.
A question online, I think this is a statement, says, first off, thank you, Dr. Jordan, and soon to be Dr. Berry. Something that I didn't hear mentioned, but I could have very well overlooked, is the notion of cremation and what the process looks like for some. Some put their ancestors in urns, boxes. They don't mention this, but keychains, wristlets, and also throwing their ashes. Throwing sounds very interesting, but spreading their ashes into mass forms of water. And I think that's part of the process of tending to the wishes of those who have deceased. When my grandmother she let us know, do not put me in that ground. She said, don't put me in that ground. For those who know me, they know that do not put me in those clouds, meaning that the airbrush clouds where you place somebody and they're like they're floating. So we all have our wishes, right? And so don't put me in the clouds, y'all. And so cremation being a part of the process in which that we tend to the actual bodies that have passed on. So thank you, Stephen, for that comment.
And I think that this also leads us to the point of like witnessing has to be capacious in order to recognize that people think about the way that they want to rest in different ways. And so how people remember the dead, depending on how they have been rested, or even if they did not have access to the body. That's another thing that could happen, right? There could be something traumatic that happens where you don't have access to your loved one to be able to bury them in a way that you would like. So I think that's one of the reasons why we have to think of a broader way of capturing and archiving witness. And also for those online who've asked for slides or references, please email us directly and then we can share those with you.
And also you should know that we do put these things online.
Yes, and the slides will also, the presentation will be online.
Thank you for the presentation again.
This is very apropos for me because my mom died last summer
I'm so sorry.
and my original home is North Carolina. And so I'm between there and here, getting ready to buy headstones and stuff. But in the process of you talking about something, I was thinking about my great grandfather and my grandfather and my great grandfather applied in the church cemetery. They're in very rural North Carolina. And now it's about 20 people, and they bought that around the time of World War II. And there are about 20 people in there now, including both my parents. And so when you were talking about this cemetery in Mississippi, I was thinking about how down south, one of our family reunions in 2018, we just visited cemeteries. And you could see, slave cemeteries and current ones. So have you guys come across, the difference between the church cemetery that you see all over the South versus the city cemetery, both black, white, whatever? And how do you feel about that? And part of the Great Migration was leaving that. And so taking care of that cemetery in Mississippi when you were in Chicago, big deal.
Right. And I think then there's like the third one, which is we forget that in the South, a lot of cemeteries were either founded or maintained by Masonic groups.
Yes.
So that was the case of our cemetery, was that it was originally run by the Oddfellows. And so Masonic groups are also, and they're often very connected to the church as well. And so there are different organizations, and some of those do no longer exist. And that's what leads to the moment of fracture in preservation, is because those organizations that were so critical at that historic moment are no longer. And so the folks who were doing the work are no longer. And we think about like Memorial Day, where that came from, right? Was Black people going to cemeteries and cleaning up the cemeteries of their loved ones. And that's where we get this idea of Memorial Day. And so I think that there's definitely kind of I don't want to say kaleidoscope, there are different sites. And one of the things that we had as a part of the field school was that we brought in somebody who was an architect, and he was an architect that specialized in Black churches. His name is Dr. Chris Hunter. He's now in Texas. He specifically talked about like these small churches will have these sites, and then sometimes the churches over time will pass hands on like who owns the land, and that can really impact preservation. And so it's really hard for these really small sites to get preserved, and it often requires the descendants stepping in to make sure that gets done. But there's definitely a difference between smaller plots, like family plots on family plots on properties, church plots, and then plots that eventually get owned by cities. Those all have like very different logistics of even how you can go through the process of care legally. I think we have to do online.
There's no questions.
Oh, there's no questions? Then Marisa.
So thank you for a great presentation, and thank you for sharing. So my question is similar to theirs, but in a slightly different angle. I was thinking about the role or the space for restitution, and as you were talking about all the factors that complicate doing this work, I remember it was early in January of last year where 215 bodies were discovered buried near a jail, and somebody had a missing report for a officer who was hit by a police car and was buried in that place, and nobody knew that they had passed. So is there, like, why is the place for talking about restitution in that conversation for these type of events where you have people being buried without their family knowing and without potential malicious activities involved being brought to justice?
Oh, yeah, I could talk a lot about that. I could also talk about at the same time, the University of Mississippi was moving a bunch of Black bodies to build a new wing of the medical school. There is a lot that I could talk about as far as how people are cared for, right? And the secrecy around that. One thing that we found when we were doing our project was there was one of the first Black representatives in Mississippi. His whole family was buried in the cemetery, and we could not find him. And we were like, no, but this is a historical figure. Like, and nobody, to this day, nobody knows where this man is buried. And we think that after he served his term, that things went a little south and that he may have ended up in a pauper's grave because of financial issues, because we kept finding some stuff in newspaper about like court dealings about missed payments and stuff like that. But when we think about places, this is really where the history part comes in, right? Because we think about the fact that the land is telling the history and that these things are reoccurring. And so we cannot divorce those bodies that were found that are people who had incidents with law enforcement and then were buried without telling their families, right? Without indicating that something happened to them, right? Cannot divorce that from also the bodies that are being moved by the University of Mississippi. Cannot be divorced from Starkville Colored Cemetery. Cannot also be divorced from folks who are dealing with mental health crises, being sent to jail, and then also dying and then be buried in the same, like all these kind of systemic issues, they come together at these sites. And so I think the work of doing this work is realizing these connections. But as far as restitution, I think this is why people are advocating for a process similar to NAGPRA that's not going to impact current burials, right, like that case, but it can potentially provide some funding and some structure for past burials and how to engage with those remains, because right now people have to think through a lot of legal strategies for even like preventing the ground from future construction once they've identified a space. So there a lot of folks don't feel like they have, like, there are actual right now with the Black Cemeteries Scholars Network, they've actually the Black Cemetery Network, they've actually brought on lawyers to work pro bono to help people to think through the actual cases that they have and the claims to land and et cetera, because it's really complicated legally. I think Dr. Hank, is there anybody on?
No.
Okay, I think Dr. Hancock, and then your hand was up.
Would you like to go? No. Okay. So thank you very much for this rich talk. I have kind of two related comments / questions. One, I was thinking about just the rituals that you show, and you both know, maybe everybody else. One of those is very much part of our family tradition in terms of jazz funerals. And the thing that I was thinking about when you think about those witnesses and the rituals and then the ways of witness, right, and the relationship between those, there's also something about those rituals that allows, and this is just the wording that came to me as you were talking, metabolizing grief. There's, I mean, going back to that first principle of embodied praxis that you were talking about, and so wanted to see if you all have thought that through. And you can't fit everything into the talk, but certainly I thought that was something worth kind of really connecting the dots on if you haven't thought about that. And then the second question kind of builds on, I was thinking about Carla Holloway's work. So her 2002 book, African American Mourning Stories, and then second book in 2011, which is really around Black cultural ethics. Also about, kind of how we think about Black death and Black memory. And the question is, are cemeteries for the dead, or are they for the living? Or are they for both? And if so, what's the relative balance as we think about what we might consider a process or a praxis of reverential decay, right? And I was thinking about that both in terms of the the local connection you were drawing with Sherrod Brown, because in Dublin, for those who don't know, there's actually a site in Dublin just in 2024, Black Cemetery reopened. And it was a white family who, again, had owned this, it was previously farmland, and then they discovered, to your exact point, right, that this used to be an African-American cemetery. And just last June, they had, kind of covered the cost and given permission to create this cemetery. And it just reopened in June of last year. And so I was just trying to think through the who determines question, the way that Bear was talking about, but more in terms of spatial utility, right? So is the restitution that Maritza is talking about, which was more kind of one-to-one, this mother didn't know anything about her son, but is there a communal restitution that could take place, right? So yes, we could restore the cemetery. The ancestors, the descendants can now go see the ancestors. But are there also ways of communally thinking about communal restitution, right? So maybe that land is no longer a cemetery. Do we need more than a plaque? Do we need more than a place to visit for those direct blood descendants? And could we think more broadly about what restitution could look like? So I know that's like 17.
I think about
It's very generous.
that was a really great question, particularly thinking around it goes back to our title, right? And our title is Tending to the Dead and Dying. And so we're intentional about not saying dead and living. And the reason why we said dead and dying, leaning on Patrice Douglas' work, leaning on Christina Sharp's work, is that when we think about the ways in which Black folks have been marked for death. Are we thinking about the immediate death? So how we lay someone to rest, but also the slow death, right? The ways in which time and climate chips away at us as we continue to live in these uncertain climates. And so we think about the question of our cemeteries or our funerals, all these things for the dead, or are they for the living? I think it's a communal aspect, right? We're all walking towards that light. We're all walking towards that light. And some people get there a little bit closer, right? And so I think about witness, people think about witness through the visual aspect. I think about the witness through the sonic, right? When you walk into the sanctuary, you hear the weeping, or you hear all the different sounds that comes along with it, right? And so I think it's a really, really good question, but I think it comes back to our title. Like, what does it mean to tend to the dead, but also tend to the ones who may get to that other aspect quicker than others?
Yeah, I just think, so one of the, I think about Jackson State's Mount Olive Cemetery. So Mount Olive Cemetery is kind of like in this historic part of Jackson, and it's right next to the COFO Center, which is where SNCC and all the kind of organizing units kind of met together during civil rights, planned a Freedom Summer. And it's across from like where Medgar Evers' offices were, and the Masonic Temple where he was, where his funerary procession went to. And so all these things, so there's this physical cemetery, but the cemetery also isn't only for the descendants, it is for like the memory of Jackson State of itself and the civil rights history that it embodies. And so I think, what Rob was talking about, this communal aspect of what it means to witness is actually like can touch several things. And I think about them as they're trying to think about what to do with their site, and they're thinking about it as a memorial, not only for the people who are buried there, some of whom are everyday regular people, and some of whom are people who had fancy titles, but also in connection to the school's legacy and the city's legacy. So I just think about that expansion, but I also think it's really great to think about that question of metabolizing grief. Not to be an anthropologist, but anthropologists have talked about in the past, like how people in certain cultures consume grief. And so I think that remembering that grief is not, is multifaceted. So it includes the sonic, it includes the repast, right? So the physical eating. After, I remember being in Mississippi. So I'm not from Mississippi. I'm not Southern. We've already covered this. But while I was in Mississippi, I attended quite a few funerals, and I was sometimes in the kitchen frying the fish and frying the chicken, even though I don't even eat chicken, for the repast. And so there is a physical consumption. There is an element that is a part of the grieving too. And so I do think that that is something we haven't thought as much. Well, one, I think now we're like on K4. Some of your questions, I think like very generative for like, this conversation is very generative for like, oh, we have a lot of work to do. But there's definitely a consumptive form of witness when you think about the repast, when you think about the tactile experiences of grieving, when you think about the imagery. I still have, different, they're not pamphlets, but
Obituaries?
not obituaries. Like when you're at a funeral, programs, and sometimes the program is a fan, sometimes the program is a booklet, sometimes the program is a card, and saving those as memories of the people that we have lost. And looking at these images that we've compiled together to remember them, like that is all a part of this process. And so as we think about, I want to continue to kind of gear us back towards the quote unquote the praxis part, but like thinking about when we're thinking about preservation, we're thinking about archiving all of that. And so not just the physical space, but also these other forms of, I don't want to say consumption because that's very, but these forms of engagement, these forms of witness.
Oh, wait, we have some.
Oh, sorry.
No. You know.
Yeah.
I think I'm really appreciating all that you've said. And I love that your scholarship is such a great example of the importance of community engagement and that piece of it. And I'm recognizing that in order to write a paper, you do need to write from the community that you know best and that you did the most history with. I'm also wondering whether now that you're in Columbus or in Central Ohio, whether you found any community engagement partner here in Central Ohio.
We are open for business. I'm just kidding. No, so when I came here, before I even came here, actually, I gave a talk with Folklore, and I know that they have a beautiful relationship with the Renville Cemetery, so I'm aware of that project, but have not been, added to that project in any formal ways. But we have really been trying to like start building those relationships, so that's why we're talking to folks at the CEC. Huh?
I said I know it takes time.
Yeah, so we're trying to build those relationships because in particular, something that is important to Kerwin, so kind of pivoting, just to take the words of Dr. Hancock and butcher it a little bit, is that like we're not here for helicoptering in, right? And so we are engaging with people with the hopes of being invited into a space where we can help, but not just like showing up at somebody's grandma's cemetery and being like, hey, you know what I can do? I know how to use a GPR machine, so that's not the intention. Although she knows how to use it, but reading it is a little. We'll work on that. But thinking about developing relationships with the people here to understand the context here. So something that we're hoping to do with the CEC is to talk with elders, especially like in Point Dexter, King Bronzeville areas, and talk about for them like their memories about burying their family members and like the stuff. Because one thing that we're really interested in understanding is like, is it that there are specific spaces here that people are quote unquote like tagging like the place in Dublin as a Black cemetery, or is it more like there's a kind of a mixture of places back home in the South and some sites smaller here in the Midwest? And so I think historically we're trying to figure that out.
Yeah.
And this will be our.
Yeah, peace, yeah, thank you for your presentation and your work, Rob, sharing. So yeah, your family, so I live in Bronzeville, from Bronzeville. So that means we need anything. I'm working on a history project in the community, so maybe there's some overlap to or anyway, community extension center is also So it'd be just easier just to tap into folks. I don't know what stage I'm, but if they need support. The second thing was, yeah, and this not wasn't my question, but it made me think about this question of like not helicopter again. We're trying to figure out who. Do y'all talk to morgues? And like, you know, it may be, I mean, I'm sure it do, but maybe that could be another avenue. Like Renee about Columbus's more Black history, in churches or whatever. But then the third thing was, which was my question. I think I do archiving of. Do y'all, is there any like collecting of stories prior to death that may be happening? So maybe it's like someone that is sick, like they know the time is coming. And so there's a part of remembering just the need for the ongoing practice of that we all will transition, and knowing because of
Yeah, I thank you for that. And I think I'm thinking about particularly like folks that I'm in community with. We, as at one point in time, young adults, but we're actually full adults now, have been more freely in talking about our wishes about our ends, and right, and so being able to prepare ourselves to have those conversations with other elders. And so we've been sitting around creating scripts. Like, all right, how do you begin to have a conversation with your mother or someone else about like, what do you want as your last wishes? And have we gotten anywhere further beyond that? No, but I do think that's really important. I think I keep going back to the theory because that's where my my work has informed this project. Is thinking about the ways in which Christina Sharp talks about how in chapter 1 of that book where she danced with her brother when he was getting ready to transition, or playing music, or sitting at someone's bedside as they transition. So I think that's a really good point of talking to other folks who have been a part of not only the care work, but the death care work of folks who are transitioning. So that's a really good point.
Yeah, and I just, we are not currently working on anything, so we're not currently conducting anything because, you know, we are still in the part of like learning and getting connected to people. And so very happy to be connected to you now. I will say in the previous project that I had, we did work with funeral home directors as well as people who create grave markers, because often sometimes they will have they keep like records of the plates that they've had in the past, and often in the South particularly, you'll see like a few establishments like made all the markers for like a very wide swath of area. So they're really great historic places in lieu of gaps. So those are all amazing recommendations. I think yeah, those would be all things that we would want to include. Terrell is one person that we have talked to who works at a funeral home here in Ohio, and so we're hoping to continue to learn from him. But we're also like open to learning from others as well. Okay.
So again, please join me in thanking. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks to you in the virtual space. Our next event will be in 2 weeks on March 20th. Dr. Karthik Krishnan will be joining us. He's one of the co-founders of AAPI Data, Asian American Pacific Islander Data. And he'll be talking about what's your DNA, your data, your narrative action plan for policy impact. So please do go ahead and join us. And thanks again.